The dining room fell silent, a second too late. In front of his parents, Xavier Bennett gripped his pregnant wife's wrist and shoved her back as if she were nothing more than an interruption. His voice stayed calm. That made it worse. He listed her failures like facts. No income, no value, no place in his future. Julia didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply steadied herself with one hand over her stomach. Around them, no one moved. What none of them understood was simple. The company that paid for this house already belonged to her. If you believe silence can carry more truth than anger, stay with this story until the end. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories about justice that unfolds quietly matter to you, consider subscribing. The house Julia Bennett lived in had always been described as comfortable, not luxurious, not modest, just enough to suggest stability without inviting questions. It sat on a quiet street in West Houston with trimmed hedges, a clean driveway, and a front porch that caught the late afternoon light. Neighbors waved. Deliveries arrived on time. Nothing about it hinted at fracture. Inside, the air carried a different weight. Julia moved slowly through the kitchen that morning, one hand resting lightly beneath her ribs, the other steadying herself against the counter. The doctor had told her to avoid stress, to rest, to keep everything as calm as possible for the baby. She followed those instructions precisely, not because she believed calm would be given to her, but because she understood it had to be maintained. From the hallway, she could hear Xavier's voice, low, irritated, not loud enough to draw attention, but sharp enough to cut through walls. He was on the phone again. "I already told you I'll handle it," he said, pacing. "No, I don't need another lecture. I just need time." A pause. Then quieter, tighter. "I said I've got it." Julia didn't turn toward the sound. She didn't need to. She had learned over time that the tone mattered more than the words. And his tone had been changing. Not suddenly. Not in ways that would alarm anyone outside the house. But steadily. Like pressure building behind something sealed. She reached for a glass, filled it with water, and set it down without drinking. Her reflection flickered faintly in the kitchen window. Calm face, neutral eyes, no visible tension. She had practiced that. Behind her, the call ended. Footsteps followed. Xavier entered the kitchen with the same controlled expression he wore when speaking to clients or neighbors. Composed, measured, almost pleasant if someone didn't look too closely. "You're up early," he said. Julia nodded once. Couldn't sleep. He glanced at the glass of water, then at her hand resting over her stomach. "You should be resting more," he added, but the concern didn't quite reach his eyes. It sounded more like an obligation than a feeling. "I am," she said quietly. A brief silence settled between them. Xavier opened the fridge, stared inside longer than necessary, then closed it again without taking anything. "We're going to my parents' place this weekend," he said, as if the decision had already been agreed upon. "Dinner. Everyone will be there." Julia looked at him then, not with resistance, just acknowledgement. "Everyone?" she asked. "My aunt, my cousin, a few others," he said. "It's been a while. They want to see us. Us." The word hung in the air for a moment. Julia nodded again. "Okay." Xavier studied her face as if expecting something more. A complaint, a hesitation, anything that would justify the tension already building in his posture. But Julia gave him nothing. She turned back to the counter, picked up the glass, and finally took a small sip. That was when his expression shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. "You could try to be a little more engaged," he said. "It's not just about you anymore." Julia set the glass down carefully. "I didn't say it was," she replied. He exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound of irritation. "Sometimes it feels like you're not even present," he continued. "Like you're just waiting. She didn't respond, because in a way she was. Xavier shook his head slightly as if dismissing a thought he didn't want to fully form. "Just be ready by 6 on Saturday," he said. "I don't want to be late." Then he left the kitchen. The house returned to silence. Julia remained where she was for a few seconds longer, her hand still resting over her stomach. The baby hadn't moved much that morning. The doctor had said that could happen, that it didn't always mean something was wrong. Still, she noted it. She noted everything. On the dining table, her phone lay face down. When it lit up, the screen cast a soft glow across the wood. She walked over and picked it up. An email notification. Sender Margaret Collins. Julia didn't open it immediately. Instead, she turned the phone over in her hand once, as if measuring the weight of what it might contain. Then she unlocked it. The message was short, direct. Final confirmation received. Transfer complete. Full control effective immediately. Documentation attached. Julia read it once. Then again. Her expression didn't change. No visible reaction. No release of breath. No tightening of her grip. Only a slight stillness deeper than before. She closed the email without opening the attachments. There would be time for that. From the living room, the muted sound of a television filled the space. Xavier had turned it on, though he wasn't really watching. The volume was low, just enough to occupy silence. Julia placed the phone back on the table. For a moment she stood there, looking at nothing in particular. Then she moved again. She rinsed the glass, wiped the counter, adjusted a chair that had been slightly out of place. Small, precise actions. Controlled. By mid-afternoon, the house looked exactly as it should, undisturbed. Later that evening, Xavier sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested the earlier tension had passed. "Mom asked what you're bringing on Saturday," he said without looking up. Julia stood near the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the frame. "I can make something simple," she said. He glanced at her then. "Nothing too basic," he replied. "You know how they are." She nodded. "I know." He watched her for a second longer. There was something in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Not quite suspicion, not quite frustration, something closer to discomfort, as if her quiet had stopped being easy to ignore. "You've been different lately," he said. Julia met his eyes. "I'm pregnant," she said. A simple explanation, one that required no further questioning. Xavier leaned back again, but the ease didn't fully return to his posture. "Just don't make things awkward on Saturday," he added. "I don't want any tension." Julia didn't answer right away. Then softly, "There won't be." He nodded as if that settled it, but Julia had already turned away. Upstairs, the bedroom was dim, the curtains drawn just enough to let in the fading light. She sat on the edge of the bed and reached for her phone again. This time, she opened the attachments. Legal documents, signatures, dates, verification codes. Everything aligned, everything complete. Her name appeared where it needed to, not once, but repeatedly. Ownership, authority, control. Julia scrolled through each page slowly, not because she doubted it, but because she understood the importance of precision. Nothing in her life had ever been built on assumption, only confirmation. When she finished, she locked the phone and placed it beside her. Her hand returned to her stomach. For a long moment she said nothing, did nothing. Then quietly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded to herself. Downstairs, Xavier laughed at something on his screen. The sound carried upward light and unburdened. It didn't reach her. Saturday was coming. And with it, a room full of people who believed they understood exactly who she was. Julia lay back slowly, careful of her balance, her breathing even. Her eyes remained open, not restless, not afraid, just aware. Because by the time they all sat down at that table, the truth would already be in the room. They just wouldn't recognize it yet. Julia Bennett had never been the kind of person people remembered clearly after a first meeting. Not because she lacked presence, but because she never tried to claim it. She spoke when necessary, listened longer than expected. And when a room grew loud with certainty, she tended to grow quieter, not smaller, but more precise. It had always been that way. Even before Houston, before Xavier, before the house that now held more silence than conversation. Years earlier, in a different city, Julia had sat in a glass-walled office that overlooked a river most people only noticed when the light hit it at the right angle. The office didn't belong to her. It belonged to a man who had built something large enough to be respected, but structured it quietly enough that few understood where the real control lived. His name was Arthur Hale. To most, he was a private investor with an interest in logistics and infrastructure. To a smaller circle, he was the architect behind a network of companies that rarely carried his name directly. To Julia, he had been something else. Not quite family, not quite mentor, but close enough that when his health began to fail, the conversations between them changed. "You don't need to run anything," Arthur had told her once. His voice steady despite the monitors beside him. "You just need to understand it." Julia had sat across from him, hands folded loosely in her lap. "I understand enough," she said. He had watched her for a long moment, then shook his head slightly. "Enough isn't the same as complete," he replied. "And the people around you will rely on that difference." Julia didn't argue. She rarely did. Instead, she asked questions, not many, but the kind that required clear answers. "What happens when control transfers?" she asked. Arthur smiled faintly. "It won't look like control," he said. "Not at first." That had been one of the last full conversations they had before his condition declined further. The legal work began soon after. Trust structures, holding entities, layered ownership across multiple jurisdictions, everything designed to ensure continuity without disruption. Julia didn't sign everything at once. She reviewed, line by line, clause by clause. She worked closely with Margaret Collins, a corporate attorney known less for public victories and more for making sure conflicts never reached a courtroom in the first place. Margaret had been direct from the beginning. "This isn't symbolic," she told Julia during one of their early meetings. "If you accept this, you're not inheriting an asset. You're inheriting responsibility." Julia nodded. "I understand." Margaret studied her for a moment. "Do you?" she asked. Julia met her gaze without hesitation. Yes, that had been enough. The process moved forward. When Arthur Hale passed, the announcement was brief, respectful, contained. There was no public reading of a will, no dramatic unveiling of beneficiaries, only a controlled release of information through legal channels that reached exactly the people it needed to reach. Inside those channels, Julia's name appeared, not as a figurehead, not as a placeholder, but as the primary beneficiary of a trust that held a controlling stake in Hale Infrastructure Group, a company that on paper looked like one of many regional logistics firms. In practice, it connected supply chains across multiple states. And among its long-standing employees were two names Julia recognized long before she met them in person. Harold Bennett, Diane Bennett. At the time, they were just entries in a report. Years of service, stable performance, no significant disciplinary history, reliable, predictable. The kind of employees a company depended on without ever fully seeing. Julia had noted their names once, then moved on. By the time she met Xavier, the legal transition had already begun, but was not yet complete. They met through mutual acquaintances at a small gathering, nothing formal, nothing strategic. Xavier had been confident, not in an obvious way, but in the way he occupied space, the way he spoke about his work, his plans, his expectations. He worked in sales at a mid-sized firm, ambitious, focused on moving up. He talked about stability like it was something you could build if you followed the right sequence of decisions. Julia had listened, asked a few questions, given little away. He found her quiet interesting, grounded, different from the people he usually met. When he mentioned his parents worked for a logistics company, he did so with a certain pride. "They've been there for years," he said. "It's not glamorous, but it's solid." Julia nodded. "What's the company called?" she asked. "Hale Infrastructure," he replied. The name settled between them. Julia didn't react, not visibly. "Sounds stable," she said. "It is," Xavier answered. "People build entire careers there." Julia smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "they do." Their relationship moved forward without complication, at least on the surface. Julia never introduced Xavier to Margaret, never mentioned the ongoing legal work. By the time the engagement happened, most of the structural changes were already in place, but final authority had not yet transferred. It was a matter of timing, verification, completion. Julia understood that. She also understood something else, that what people revealed when they believed they were secure was often more accurate than anything they said under pressure. So she waited. Not passively, but deliberately. She watched how Xavier spoke about success, about money, about people who had more than he did. At first, it was subtle. A comment here, a comparison there. Then gradually it became clearer. He didn't just want stability. He wanted recognition, position, proof that he had moved beyond where he started. Julia didn't judge him for that. She simply noted it. Back in the present, the bedroom in Houston felt smaller than the office Julia remembered. Not physically, but in the way it held fewer possibilities. She sat at the edge of the bed, the documents from Margaret still open on her phone. Each page confirmed what had been building for years: final signatures, board acknowledgments, transfer of voting rights. Effective immediately. Julia Bennett was now the controlling owner of Hale Infrastructure Group. Not in theory, in fact. She locked the screen and set the phone down beside her. For a moment, she let the silence settle. Then she leaned back slightly, one hand resting over her stomach. The baby shifted. A small movement, but enough. Julia closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. Downstairs, she could hear Xavier moving through the house again, opening cabinets, closing drawers, the ordinary sounds of a life that still believed it was unchanged. He didn't know. Not about the company, not about the documents, not about the timing, and not about what that timing meant in relation to everything else that had already happened. Julia opened her eyes again. There were still steps to take. Not emotional ones, procedural ones. She would meet with Margaret again, review the next phase, coordinate with Victor Hale, the company's CFO, who had already begun preparing internal reports for the upcoming board review. Everything would move forward as it was designed to. Quietly, accurately, without unnecessary attention. Because control, as Arthur had said, did not always look like control. Not at first. Julia stood slowly adjusting to the shift in her balance. She walked to the window and pulled the curtain back slightly. Outside, the street looked the same as it always had. Still, ordered, predictable. Inside, something had already changed. Not in a way that could be seen, but in a way that would eventually become impossible to ignore. Saturday was approaching, and with it a room full of people who had already decided who she was. Julia let the curtain fall back into place. Then she turned away from the window. There was nothing left to prepare emotionally, only what needed to be done. By Thursday, the house had settled into a pattern that looked almost peaceful from the outside. Mornings were quiet. Afternoons passed without interruption. Evenings carried the soft hum of routine television in the background, the occasional sound of dishes' footsteps moving from one room to another. Nothing in that rhythm suggested instability. But Julia had learned that stability, when forced, often carried the clearest signs of strain. Xavier had been coming home later, not dramatically late. Not enough to raise immediate concern from anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But the shift was consistent. 30 minutes, then an hour, then more. When he did come home, he moved through the house with a restlessness that didn't match his usual need for control. He checked his phone frequently, took calls in the hallway instead of the living room, lowered his voice when speaking, but not enough to remove the tension from it. Julia noticed all of it. She didn't ask. On Thursday evening, he entered the house just after 8. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms. There was a faint scent of something sharper than usual alcohol, but not enough to suggest loss of control. Just enough to soften edges. "You're still up," he said, glancing toward the kitchen where Julia stood. "I usually am," she replied. He nodded as if confirming something to himself. Dinner had already been prepared, set neatly on the table, covered. Julia had eaten earlier, as her doctor recommended. Small portions, consistent timing. Xavier uncovered the plate, looked at it briefly, then sat down without another word. He ate quickly, not out of hunger, but out of distraction. Halfway through, his phone lit up beside his hand. He checked it immediately, his expression tightening for a fraction of a second before smoothing out again. Julia watched from across the room, her posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. "Work?" she asked. Xavier didn't look up. "Something like that." A vague answer. "Intentional." Julia nodded once, accepting it without pressing further. Silence returned. After a moment, he set his fork down and leaned back slightly, exhaling, as if finishing a task rather than a meal. "I might need to move some things around this weekend," he said. Julia's gaze shifted to him. "In what way? Just timing," he replied. "I've got a few calls I need to take. Nothing major." The explanation didn't align with the certainty in his earlier plans. Julia noticed. "You said dinner was at 6, she said. "It is," he answered quickly. "I'll be there." A beat passed. "Just don't make it complicated," he added, his tone sharpening slightly. "It's already been a long week." Julia held his gaze for a second longer than usual. Then she looked away. "I won't," she said. Later that night, after Xavier had gone upstairs, Julia remained in the living room. The television was on, but she wasn't watching it. Her phone rested in her hand, the screen open to a series of documents Victor Hale had forwarded earlier that afternoon. Financial summaries, transaction logs, internal flags. Nothing that would alarm someone unfamiliar with the details. But to Julia, the pattern was clear. Several transfers had been made over the past 2 months, amounts just below the threshold that would trigger automatic review. Accounts that connected indirectly to individuals Xavier had mentioned in passing. Colleagues, contacts, opportunities. The language he used had always been careful, broad, nonspecific. Now the structure behind it was visible. Julia scrolled slowly, her expression unchanged. There was no immediate conclusion drawn, only recognition, and then a quiet confirmation of what had already been forming beneath the surface. From the staircase, a faint creak signaled movement above. Julia locked her phone and set it beside her. Moments later, Xavier Waish appeared at the top of the stairs, pausing as if surprised to find her still awake. "You should be sleeping," he said. Julia looked up at him. "I will." He studied her for a moment, his brow tightening slightly. "You've been on your phone a lot lately," he added. It wasn't an accusation, not yet, but it was close. Julia didn't shift. "I've had things to review," she said. "What things?" he asked. A simple question, but one that carried more weight than he intended to show. Julia met his eyes. "Medical information," she replied. The answer was true, just not complete. Xavier held her gaze for a second longer, as if deciding whether to continue. Then he nodded. "Right," he said. "Of course." He turned and went back into the bedroom. The conversation ended there. But something in the air had changed. The next morning, Julia left the house for the first time that week. Not for long, just enough to create a record. She drove to a small medical office, checked in, spoke briefly with Dr. Emily Carter, and confirmed her next appointment. Routine, documented, necessary. From there, she stopped at a quiet cafe a few blocks away. She didn't order anything complicated, just tea. She sat near the window, her phone placed carefully on the table in front of her. At exactly 10:30 it rang. Margaret Collins. Julia answered on the first vibration. "Good morning," Margaret said. "Good morning." A brief pause. "I've reviewed the latest reports Victor sent over." Margaret continued. "There are enough irregularities to justify internal review, possibly more depending on how far it goes." Julia listened without interrupting. "And the transfers?" she asked. "Fully confirmed," Margaret replied. "There's no ambiguity. You have complete control." Julia's gaze shifted to the street outside. Cars passed, people walked. Nothing paused. "Then we proceed as planned," she said. Margaret didn't respond immediately. "Are you certain you want to wait until the board meeting?" she asked. "Yes." Another pause. "You understand that once this becomes visible, it will escalate quickly," Margaret said. "I do." "And your husband?" Margaret added, her tone more measured now. Julia didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice remained steady. "He'll be informed through the same process as everyone else. Not earlier, not privately, not with warning." Margaret exhaled softly. "Understood," she said. "I'll finalize the agenda." The call ended. Julia placed the phone back on the table. Her tea had gone untouched. She lifted the cup, took a small sip, and set it down again. Across the street, a man laughed into his phone, unaware of anything beyond his immediate conversation. The world continued, as it always did, unaware of shifts that had already taken place. That evening, Xavier returned home earlier than expected. Julia was in the kitchen again, preparing something simple for herself. He watched her for a moment from the doorway. "You went out today," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Where Julia turned slightly. "Doctor's office?" His expression tightened. "You didn't tell me." "I didn't think it was necessary," she replied. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not anger, not yet, but something closer to loss of control. "You should let me know these things," he said. Julia faced him fully now. "I will," she said. The answer was calm, measured, and just vague enough to offer no real promise. Xavier held her gaze, then slowly he nodded. "Saturday," he said, as if returning to safer ground. "Don't forget, I won't." He turned away, but the tension followed him. Julia remained where she was, one hand resting lightly on the counter, the other over her stomach. The house was quiet again. But beneath that quiet, everything had already begun to move. Not loudly, not visibly, but precisely. And by the time Saturday arrived, Nothing in that house would mean what it once did. Saturday arrived without ceremony. The morning light filtered through the curtains in thin, controlled lines, stretching across the bedroom floor without warmth. Julia had been awake long before it appeared. Not restless, not anxious, simply aware of time as it moved forward with quiet certainty. She sat at the edge of the bed, one hand resting lightly over her stomach, feeling the slow, steady rhythm beneath her palm. The baby had been moving more regularly since the previous evening. Small movements, consistent. She noted that too. Across the room, Xavier had adjusted his watch in the mirror. His movements were precise, deliberate, as if preparing for something more formal than a family dinner. "You should wear something decent," he said without turning. "Not too plain?" Julia looked at him. "I understand." He nodded, satisfied with the response. There was no further discussion. By late afternoon, the house was quiet again, but not in the same way it had been during the week. This quiet held anticipation. Julia stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the fabric of her dress. It was simple, light in color, structured enough to present well, but not designed to draw attention. Her hair was pulled back neatly. No excess jewelry, no unnecessary detail. Everything about her appearance was controlled, measured. She picked up her phone from the dresser and glanced at the screen. No new messages. Everything that needed to be in place already was. She set the phone down again and turned toward the door. The drive to Harold and Diane Bennett's house took just under 30 minutes. The streets were familiar, the turns predictable. Xavier drove in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift. His posture was composed, but the tension hadn't left him. It had only settled deeper. "You don't have to say much tonight," he said suddenly. "Just don't make it uncomfortable." Julia turned her head slightly toward him. "I won't," she replied. He nodded once, eyes still on the road. "That's all I'm asking." Julia didn't answer, because that wasn't all he was asking. It was just all he was willing to say out loud. Harold and Diane's house was larger than Julia's. Not excessively so, but enough to suggest a long accumulation of stability. The lights were already on when they arrived. Voices carried faintly through the front door before it opened. Diane greeted them first. "There you are," she said, her tone bright but measured. Her eyes moved quickly over Julia, pausing briefly at her stomach before returning to her face. "Come in." Julia stepped inside without hesitation. The house smelled like food that had been prepared carefully and for a long time. Multiple dishes, multiple hands involved. In the living room, several relatives had already gathered. Conversations paused briefly as Julia and Xavier entered, then resumed with a shift in tone. Acknowledgement, assessment. Julia greeted them politely. No more, no less. Harold stood near the dining table, speaking with someone Julia didn't recognize. When he noticed them, he gave a small nod. "You made it," he said. Xavier smiled. "Of course." Harold's gaze moved to Julia. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Fine," she replied. He nodded again, but the question hadn't been about concern. It had been about confirmation, that she was still exactly where they expected her to be. As the evening settled, people moved toward the dining area. Plates were set, glasses filled, chairs pulled into place. Julia took her seat, carefully positioning herself in a way that allowed her space without drawing attention to it. Xavier sat beside her. Diane moved around the table, adjusting placements, ensuring everything appeared coordinated. The conversation began lightly. Work updates, family news, small stories that required polite responses. Julia listened. She responded when necessary. Her voice remained even, controlled. Across the table, a cousin began discussing recent promotions at a company. Hale infrastructure is expanding again, he said. New contracts, new routes. It's a good time to be there. Harold nodded, a quiet pride settling into his expression. It's steady work, he said. Has been for years. Diane added, not everyone understands how valuable that kind of stability is. Her gaze shifted briefly toward Julia. The implication didn't need to be stated directly. Julia acknowledged it with a slight nod. I'm sure it is, she said. Xavier leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxing in the familiarity of the conversation. That's why I've been looking into it more seriously, he said. There might be opportunities to move in that direction. Harold glanced at him. You'd need the right connections, he replied. Xavier smiled faintly. I have some. The table quieted for a moment, not enough to interrupt the flow, but enough to mark the shift. Julia remained still. Her hands rested lightly in her lap. She didn't look at Xavier. She didn't need to. Diane placed another dish at the center of the table. Well, she said, her tone lighter now. Some people earn their place. Others just arrive. A soft laugh followed from one end of the table. Not loud, but not subtle either. Julia lifted her glass and took a small sip of water. No reaction, no correction. Across from her, Xavier's expression sharpened slightly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Speaking of that, he said, his voice calm, controlled. The conversations around them began to quiet. Not fully, but enough. There's something I think needs to be clear, he continued. Julia's gaze remained forward, her breathing steady. Julia hasn't exactly been contributing much lately, he said. And with everything coming up, that matters. The words were delivered without hesitation, as if they had been prepared, as if the moment had been chosen. Diane didn't interrupt. Harold didn't look away. No one at the table spoke. Julia placed her glass back down. Carefully. The sound was soft, precise. Xavier continued. I mean, let's be honest, he said. We're talking about real responsibilities now, real pressure. And I'm the one carrying it. A pause, then quieter. She's just here. The sentence settled into the room, not loudly, but completely. Julia's hand moved instinctively to her stomach. A small motion, almost imperceptible. She didn't look at him, didn't respond, didn't defend, because defense would have implied that the moment belonged to him. And it didn't. Not entirely. Across the table, someone shifted in their seat. Another person glanced down, but no one spoke. The silence returned, heavier now, more defined. And in that silence, something had already begun to fracture. Not visibly, not yet, but enough. Julia lifted her eyes slightly, not toward Xavier, not toward anyone in particular, just enough to take in the room, the faces, the expressions, the absence of intervention. She noted all of it, every detail, because what came next would not depend on memory. It would depend on precision. Xavier leaned back again, as if concluding something, as if the matter had been settled, as if his version of the moment was the only one that would remain. Julia said nothing, because she understood something he didn't. That a moment doesn't end when the words stop. It ends when the truth is allowed to surface. And that hadn't happened yet. Not fully, not completely, but it was coming, slowly, exactly as it needed to. For a few seconds after Xavier's last sentence, the room remained suspended in a silence so complete it seemed to press against the walls. No one corrected him. No one told him he had gone too far. Diane adjusted her napkin with deliberate care, as if the arrangement of folded linen required more attention than the woman sitting beside her son. Harold lowered his gaze to his plate. One of the cousins reached for a glass and then stopped halfway, suddenly aware that even a small sound would be heard too clearly. Julia sat still. Her hand remained over her stomach. Her face did not harden. It did not crumble either. She looked exactly as she had a moment earlier, composed, quiet, unreadable except for the deeper stillness that settled around her whenever something important had been confirmed. Across from her, Xavier mistook that stillness for surrender. He gave a short, humorless laugh, then leaned forward again, his voice softer now, almost intimate, which made the cruelty worse. "You don't even say anything," he said. "That's the problem. You just sit there like someone else will eventually come fix your life for you." A few eyes lifted then, not in protest, but in the uneasy curiosity of people who sensed that they were no longer watching an argument. They were watching a line being crossed. Julia turned her head toward him at last. Not quickly, not dramatically. She looked at him the way a person looks at a locked door after hearing the bolt slide into place on the other side. "I'm not asking anyone to fix anything," she said. Her tone was low and even, the first words she had offered him since he began. Xavier's jaw tightened. He had expected tears, perhaps, or apology, or embarrassment large enough to give the room relief by making the scene simple again. Husband, angry wife, emotional family, awkward dinner, ruined. Something ordinary in its ugliness. What he got instead was restraint. And restraint in front of witnesses has a way of exposing the person who has none. "You should be," he said, "because right now, all you do is make everything heavier." Julia's fingers moved slightly against the fabric over her stomach. A protective gesture, small enough to miss if no one was looking carefully. But someone was. At the far end of the table, Xavier's younger cousin Nolan had left his phone beside his water glass, with the camera lens facing outward after showing someone a photo earlier. The device sat dark and still, but the screen had not fully locked. At some point in the last minute, perhaps from an accidental tap, perhaps from nervous instinct, it had begun recording. Nolan himself didn't realize it yet. Neither did anyone else. Julia took one slow breath, then another. "Xavier," Harold said at last without conviction. "That's enough." But it wasn't enough to stop him. It was only enough to prove that Harold knew exactly what he was seeing. Xavier pushed his chair back. The scrape of wood against the floor cut through the room. He stood too quickly, anger rising now that the performance had failed to produce submission. He looked down at Julia, who remained seated, and something in that imbalance seemed to sharpen his need to dominate the space. "You want to sit there and act calm," he said. "Fine. But don't pretend you're not living off me while I carry all of this." Diane murmured his name, but she did not stand. Julia began to shift, not away from him, only enough to rise carefully from her chair. That was when he caught her wrist. The movement happened fast enough to break the room's paralysis, but not fast enough to prevent what followed. His fingers closed around her arm just below the hand she had braced on the table. Not a theatrical gesture, not a wild swing. Something more controlled, more personal, more dangerous for precisely that reason. "Sit down," he said. Julia tried to pull back, not sharply. Her body was carrying too much weight, too much caution. She turned instinctively to protect her abdomen, and the chair behind her shifted at the wrong angle. Xavier jerked her arm once impatiently. The chair leg caught. Julia lost her balance. A sharp gasp tore through the room as her hip struck the edge of the chair and her body pitched sideways. She managed to twist enough to avoid falling directly onto her stomach, but the force sent her against the corner of the buffet table before she hit the floor on one knee. Her breath left her in a sound too thin to be called a cry. Her hand flew to her belly. For one suspended second, no one moved. Then chaos arrived all at once. Julia Nolan shouted, lurching out of his chair. Diane rose so suddenly her glass tipped over water running across the tablecloth. Harold came around the table, his face drained of color. Someone in the doorway said, "Oh my God," in a voice that did not sound real. Julia remained on the floor, one knee bent beneath her, one hand gripping the edge of the buffet, the other pressed hard over her stomach. Her face had gone pale. Not dramatically, not fainting, just a terrible, unmistakable loss of color. "Don't touch me," she said when Xavier stepped toward her. The words were quiet. They stopped him anyway. He stared down at her as if he had not expected the scene to become visible in this way, as if the fall itself had betrayed him by existing. "I didn't," he began, then stopped. Because too many people had seen it, because half-finished lies collapse fastest in rooms with witnesses. Harold bent down, hands hovering uselessly. "Julia, are you hurt?" Julia did not answer him. She was concentrating on her breathing, on the pressure in her abdomen, on the sudden cold spreading through her limbs. Nolan had finally noticed his phone screen still lit, still capturing the room from the far end of the table. He snatched it up, eyes widening, but he didn't stop the recording. Not yet. Diane turned on Xavier then, not with moral clarity, but with fear. "What did you do?" she demanded. Xavier looked at her, then at Julia, then around the room, at the faces that would remember this night long after the food was cleared away. "I barely touched her," he said. Julia lifted her head. For the first time that evening, her eyes met his with something colder than hurt. "Call an ambulance," she said. No one argued after that. Nolan was already dialing. Harold moved toward the front door to wave the paramedics in when they arrived. Diane grabbed her purse with shaking hands, speaking too fast, offering blankets, water, useless things. Xavier stood in the center of the dining room as the scene reorganized around the consequences of his hand. Julia let Harold help her into a chair only after the call had been made. She sat carefully, every movement measured through pain. Then, while everyone else looked toward the door, toward the hallway, toward the emergency still on its way, Julia looked once at Nolan's phone. Long enough to know. Long enough to understand that the room had not been depending on memory after all. When the sirens finally sounded in the distance, Xavier's face changed. Not into remorse, into fear. Real fear. Because for the first time that night, he understood that what had happened would not stay inside the family. The sirens grew louder as they approached, cutting through the quiet suburban street with a clarity that left no room for denial. Inside the house, everything had slowed. Not because the situation had calmed, but because everyone had shifted into a waiting state, suspended between what had already happened and what would soon be recorded by people who had no reason to soften it. Julia sat upright in the chair. Harold had brought her back straight despite the discomfort. One hand remained pressed over her stomach, not out of panic, but out of careful awareness. Her breathing was measured, controlled, each inhale deliberate, each exhale steady. Across the room, Xavier had stepped back toward the wall. He wasn't pacing anymore. He wasn't speaking. He stood still as if movement itself might draw more attention to him than he could afford. Diane hovered near Julia, asking questions that Julia did not answer. "Are you in pain? Can you feel the baby? Do you need water?" The questions came quickly without pause, as if filling silence could undo what had already been done. Julia did not respond to most of them. Not because she couldn't, but because she was prioritizing something else. Clarity. The front door opened before anyone reached for it. 2 paramedics entered, followed by a third carrying equipment. Their presence shifted the room immediately. Voices lowered. Movements became more precise. The emotional weight that had filled the space was replaced by procedure. "Who's the patient?" one of them asked. Julia lifted her eyes slightly. "I am." They approached her, carefully assessing without assumption. "What happened?" the second paramedic asked. A brief pause. Julia did not look at Xavier. "I lost my balance," she said. The answer was simple. Incomplete, but not incorrect. The paramedic nodded, already moving through a checklist. "Are you pregnant?" "Yes." "How far along 26 weeks?" The exchange remained clinical, measured. No one interrupted. Even Xavier stayed silent, because in that moment the version of events being spoken aloud was not his to control. They helped Julia to her feet, slowly supporting her weight without rushing her movements. She did not resist. She adjusted, followed, allowed herself to be guided toward the door. As she passed the dining table, her gaze flicked once toward Nolan. His phone was now in his hand, the screen dark, but his expression had changed. He understood, not fully, but enough. Outside, the ambulance lights washed the front of the house in red and white. Neighbors had begun to notice. Curtains shifted. Doors opened slightly. Visibility had arrived. Julia stepped into it without hesitation. The ride to the hospital was quiet, not empty, just controlled. The paramedic seated beside her monitored her vitals, asking occasional questions, noting her responses. Another adjusted equipment near her feet. The third communicated with the hospital ahead. Julia answered when needed. Briefly, clearly, her hand remained over her stomach. At one point, the paramedic looked up from the monitor. "Any pain?" a little Julia replied. "Sharp or dull, consistent." He nodded, marking it down. "We'll have OB ready when we arrive," he said. Julia closed her eyes for a moment. Not to rest, just to focus. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. Doors opened. Instructions were exchanged. A nurse took over, guiding the stretcher down a bright corridor that seemed too clean for what it was about to hold. "Julia Bennett?" a voice asked. Julia opened her eyes. Dr. Emily Carter stood at the foot of the bed, already in motion. "I'm here," Julia said. Dr. Carter nodded once. "We're going to take a look, all right. Just stay with me." Julia did. The examination was thorough, careful, focused entirely on the baby first, then on Julia. Monitors were attached, ultrasound prepared. A nurse recorded details while another adjusted the bed. The room filled with quiet efficiency. No one raised their voice. No one asked unnecessary questions. After several minutes that felt longer than they were, Dr. Carter exhaled. "The baby's heartbeat is steady," she said. The words settled into the room. Not as relief, but as stability. "We'll need to monitor you for a few hours," she continued. "There's been some trauma. I don't want to take any chances." Julia nodded. "I understand." Dr. Carter studied her face. "What happened?" she asked, softer now. Julia held her gaze. "I fell," she said. Dr. Carter didn't respond immediately. She had seen enough cases to recognize the difference between an accident and something else. But she also understood something more important, that the patient would decide when the full truth entered the record. "All right," she said. "We'll focus on you for now." Xavier arrived 20 minutes later. He didn't come in immediately. He stood just outside the room, speaking to someone at the nurse's station. His voice low, controlled, urgent in a way that tried to sound calm. When he finally entered, his posture had returned to something resembling composure. He approached the bed slowly. Julia turned her head slightly to look at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he leaned closer. "I didn't mean for that to happen," he said. The words were quiet, measured, carefully chosen. Julia watched him. Her expression did not change. "I know," she said. It was not forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. Xavier exhaled, as if that response gave him something to stand on. He began, then stopped. It got out of hand. Julia shifted slightly against the pillow. Her hand remained where it had been since the fall. Did it? She asked. The question was soft, but it held. Xavier looked at her uncertain for the first time. I'm here now, he said. That's what matters. Julia did not answer, because that was not what mattered. Not anymore. An hour later, Margaret Collins arrived. She did not rush into the room. She paused at the doorway, taking in the scene with a single, practiced glance. Then she stepped inside. Julia, she said. Julia turned her head. Margaret. No introduction was made. No explanation offered. Margaret approached the bed, placing her folder on the small table beside it. I came as soon as I could, she said. Julia nodded. Thank you. Margaret's eyes moved briefly toward Xavier. Not questioning, not surprised, just noting. Then back to Julia. Have you spoken to anyone about what happened, she asked. Julia held her gaze. Not yet. Margaret inclined her head slightly. Good, she said. We'll do this properly. Xavier straightened. What is that supposed to mean? He asked. Margaret turned to him for the first time. It means, she said evenly, that from this point forward, communication will go through me. The room shifted. Subtly, but completely. Xavier frowned. I'm her husband, he said. Margaret's expression did not change. And she is my client. Silence followed, not the same silence as before. This one had structure, direction. Julia looked at Margaret, then at Xavier, then back at Margaret. Start with the records, she said. Margaret nodded once. I already have them. Julia's hand rested lightly over her stomach. Her breathing steady, her voice unchanged. But something in the room had moved. Not emotionally, not visibly, but in a way that would not reverse. Because whatever this had been before a family issue, a private mistake, a moment that could be minimized, it was no longer that. Now it had a record. And soon it would have a process. The hospital room settled into a quieter rhythm after midnight. Machines continued their steady work. The soft, consistent beeping of monitors created a structure that replaced the chaos of earlier hours. Nurses moved in and out with minimal conversation, checking readings, adjusting settings, recording observations. Julia remained awake. Not because she couldn't sleep, but because there was still too much that required her attention. Margaret Collins sat in the chair beside the bed, a folder open across her lap. The documents inside were arranged with the same precision Julia expected from her chronological labeled cross-referenced. On the small table nearby, Julia's phone rested face up. Silent, but no longer passive. Xavier had left the room an hour earlier, not by choice. Margaret had made that clear without raising her voice. We'll need some time, she had said. And that had been enough. Now the space belonged to procedure. Let's start with the immediate record, Margaret said quietly, her voice low enough to remain private but clear enough to carry authority. You told the paramedics you lost your balance. Julia nodded slightly. I did. Margaret didn't look up from the page she was reviewing. That gives us flexibility, she said. It doesn't contradict what happened. It just doesn't define it yet. Julia's gaze remained steady. That was intentional, she said. I know, Margaret replied. A brief pause settled between them. Margaret turned a page. I've already requested the hospital's intake report, vital records, and imaging notes, she continued. Dr. Carter's preliminary observations are consistent with blunt impact, but not severe enough to trigger immediate escalation. That works in our favor. Julia listened without interruption. We also need external documentation, Margaret added. Anything from the house, witness statements, digital evidence. Julia's eyes shifted just slightly. There is a recording, she said. Margaret looked up then. From where a phone, Julia replied. At the table. It was active during the incident. Margaret held her gaze for a moment longer than usual. Do you know who has it? Yes. Will they cooperate? Julia considered the question for a fraction of a second. They don't understand the full weight of what they have yet, she said. But they will. Margaret nodded once, already adjusting her plan. I'll reach out in the morning, she said. We'll secure a copy before anything gets lost, deleted, or reconsidered. Julia understood what that meant. Not everyone chose accuracy when pressure entered the room, especially when that pressure came from family. Across the hospital, Xavier stood alone near a vending machine that hummed louder than necessary. He hadn't moved in several minutes, not because he had nowhere to go, but because every direction now carried consequences. He replayed the moment in his head. Not the entire evening, just the part that mattered. The grip on her wrist, the pull, the frame of the fall. In his memory it remained smaller than it had looked. Less force, less intention, less responsibility. But memory wasn't the only thing that existed anymore. There had been too many eyes, too many angles, and now a lawyer. That part unsettled him more than anything else. Margaret Collins hadn't raised her voice, hadn't accused him directly, but the shift she introduced into the room had been unmistakable. From that point on, nothing he said would stand alone. Everything would be measured, verified, compared. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. Then he reached for his phone. 3 missed calls from Diane, 2 from Harold, a message from Nolan. We need to talk. Xavier stared at the screen for a moment. Then he locked it again without responding. Back in the room, Margaret closed the folder halfway. There's another layer we need to address, she said. Julia turned her head slightly. The company, Margaret continued. Julia didn't react outwardly, but the shift in topic was clear. Victor sent over the latest internal review, Margaret said. There are irregular financial movements tied to Xavier. Not directly through the company, but through associated accounts that intersect with individuals he's been communicating with. Julia absorbed that without visible reaction. Timing, she asked. Within the last 60 days, Margaret replied. Escalating. Julia's fingers moved slightly against the blanket. He's trying to position himself, she said. Yes, Margaret's tone remained neutral. And he believes he has access through his parents. Julia looked at her. He does, she said. Just not in the way he thinks. Margaret allowed the corner of that statement to settle before continuing. The board meeting is scheduled for Monday morning, she said. We can move it sooner if necessary. Julia shook her head slightly. No. Margaret studied her. You want it to proceed as planned? Yes, even with everything that's happened. Julia's gaze remained steady, especially because of it. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair. There was no disagreement in her expression, only acknowledgement. Then we'll proceed, she said. At 2 a.m, the nurse returned to check Julia's vitals. Still stable, she said, softly adjusting the monitor. Baby's doing well. Julia nodded. Thank you. When the nurse left the room, grew quiet again. Margaret closed the folder fully this time. I'll stay until morning, she said. You don't have to, Julia replied. I know. That was the end of that exchange. Across the city, Diane sat at her kitchen table, the remains of dinner still untouched around her. The house felt different now. Not because anything had changed physically, but because something had been seen that could not be unseen. Harold stood near the window looking out into the dark street. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Diane broke the silence. He said it was an accident. Harold didn't turn. I know what he said. Another pause. He wouldn't. She began, then stopped. Because the rest of the sentence required certainty she no longer had. Harold exhaled slowly. There were too many people there, he said. Too many people who saw it. Diane looked down at her hands. And now there's a lawyer, she added. The words sat heavily between them. Not just because of what it implied, but because of what it signaled. This was no longer contained, no longer manageable through conversation alone. Harold turned then, his expression tighter than it had been earlier. We need to be careful, he said. Diane nodded, but neither of them yet understood how careful would not be enough. Back in the hospital, Julia finally closed her eyes. Not to escape, but to conserve. Her hand remained over her stomach, the position now instinctive. Margaret watched her for a moment, then looked down at the folder again. Everything was aligning. The incident, the records, the timing. Individually, each piece mattered. Together, they formed something far more precise, something that would not depend on emotion, only sequence, only fact. And in that sequence, Julia was no longer reacting. She was directing, slowly, quietly, exactly as she intended. Morning arrived at the hospital without announcement. The shift change brought new voices, new footsteps, and a fresh layer of clinical distance. Curtains were adjusted. Charts were updated. Light filtered in through narrow windows, turning everything a shade more visible than it had been during the night. Julia opened her eyes before anyone spoke to her. Her body felt heavier but stable. The dull ache remained, but it had settled into something predictable. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach. The baby responded. A small movement, consistent. She noted that. Across the room, Margaret was already awake, seated upright, with the same folder open, though the pages had shifted. A legal pad rested beside it, now filled with notes written in tight, controlled lines. "You're awake," Margaret said. "Yes." "How are you feeling?" "Stable." Margaret nodded once, as if that confirmed something already expected. "We'll have a few things to address this morning," she said, "before anyone else gets involved." Julia turned her head slightly toward her. "Has anyone contacted you?" she asked. Margaret glanced at her phone. "Several attempts," she said. "Your husband, his parents. I haven't responded." Julia accepted that without comment. There was a rhythm to this now. Timing mattered. Sequence mattered more. Across town, Xavier hadn't slept. He sat in the driver's seat of his car outside the hospital parking structure. His phone in his hand, the screen lit with messages he had read but not answered. Diane had called again at dawn. This time, he picked up. "Where are you?" she asked immediately. "At the hospital," he said. "How is she?" "She's fine," Xavier replied. "They're just keeping her for observation." There was a pause on the other end. "And the baby, they said it's okay." Another pause. Longer. Xavier, Diane said carefully, "We need to talk about last night." He exhaled slowly, looking out through the windshield at nothing in particular. "It was an accident," he said. Diane didn't respond right away. "There were a lot of people there," she said finally. "I know." "And Nolan?" She continued, then stopped. Xavier's grip tightened slightly around the phone. "What about Nolan?" he asked. "He has a recording." The words landed cleanly. No emphasis, no dramatics, just fact. Xavier closed his eyes for a brief second. "How much?" he asked. "Enough," Diane said. Silence followed. Not confusion, not denial, recognition. Xavier leaned back in his seat, the controlled structure he had maintained since the night before, beginning to fracture at the edges. "Has he sent it to anyone?" he asked. "Not yet," Diane replied. "But he doesn't know what to do with it." Xavier let out a slow breath. "I'll handle it," he said. The same words he had used before. But this time, they carried less certainty. Diane heard that. Xavier, she said, her tone shifting slightly. This isn't something you can just... I said, I'll handle it. He ended the call before she could finish. For a moment he sat there, the phone still in his hand. Then he unlocked it again and opened his messages. Nolan's text remained at the top. "We need to talk." Xavier stared at it, then typed, "Delete it. It's not what it looks like." He hesitated, then sent it. Back in the hospital, Julia had been moved to a more private room, not for comfort, for discretion. Margaret stood near the window, speaking quietly into her phone. "Yes," she said. "I'll need a copy preserved exactly as it is. No edits, no compression. Original file only." A pause. "I understand," she continued. "But make it clear that once this becomes part of a legal record, any attempt to alter or withhold it will carry consequences." She ended the call and turned back toward Julia. "That was Nolan," she said. "He still has the recording." Julia's expression remained unchanged. "Will he cooperate?" Margaret considered the question. "He's unsure," she said, "which means he's still thinking for himself." "That's useful." Julia nodded slightly. "What about Xavier?" she asked. Margaret picked up her phone again, scrolling briefly. "He's already contacted him," she said. "Asked him to delete it." Julia absorbed that. "Expected," she said. Margaret studied her for a moment. "You're not concerned?" Julia's gaze remained steady. "No." Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly. Why Julia's hand rested lightly against the blanket. "Because pressure reveals priorities," she said. "And once someone sees what something really is, it's difficult to convince them it's something else." Margaret allowed that to settle, then nodded. "I'll secure the file within the hour," she said. At 10 o'clock, Dr. Emily Carter returned. She reviewed the latest readings, checked Julia's condition, and nodded with quiet approval. "Everything remains stable," she said. "No signs of immediate complications." Julia inclined her head slightly. "Thank you." Dr. Carter hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I need to ask again," she said, "about what happened." Julia looked at her. The room remained still. Margaret did not interrupt. She did not need to. Julia's voice when she spoke was calm. "There was an incident," she said. Dr. Carter's expression did not change. "What kind of incident?" Julia held her gaze. "One that requires documentation," she replied. "That was enough, for now." Dr. Carter nodded slowly. "I'll note that," she said. "If you choose to expand on it later, we can update the record." Julia understood the offer, and the timing it allowed. At the same time across the city, Nolan sat in his apartment staring at his phone. The video was still there, untouched, unedited. He had watched it twice, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to be sure. Each time it felt worse, not louder, not more dramatic, just clearer. Xavier's message sat below it. "Delete it. It's not what it looks like." Nolan read it again, then looked back at the video, then back at the message. His thumb hovered over the screen. For a moment the decision felt simple. Family, loyalty, protection. But the image in the video didn't align with those words, not cleanly, not convincingly. And once that misalignment was seen, it couldn't be unseen. His phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown number. "This is Margaret Collins. I represent Julia Bennett. I'd like to speak with you regarding the recording from last night." Nolan stared at the message, then at Xavier's, then at the video. 3 versions of the same moment, each asking for a different outcome. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Then he opened a new message. "To Margaret. I still have it?" He paused, then added, "I haven't sent it to anyone." And finally, what happens next, back in the hospital? Margaret's phone vibrated. She read the message, then looked at Julia. "He's ready," she said. Julia nodded once, not in relief, in confirmation, because the process was moving exactly as it needed to. Outside the window, the city continued without interruption. Cars moved, people walked. Conversations unfolded that had nothing to do with what was now taking shape inside a single hospital room. But that didn't change the direction of what had already begun. Because now there was a record, a witness, and a decision that had not been made out of fear, but out of clarity. And once clarity enters a situation like this, it doesn't leave. It builds, step by step, exactly as it was meant to. By Monday morning, the city had already returned to its usual pace. Traffic filled the highways. Office towers reflected the early light. People moved through lobbies with coffee in hand, speaking about deadlines, meetings numbers that would be reviewed and revised before the day ended. Inside Hale Infrastructure Group's headquarters, the rhythm felt familiar. But the structure beneath it had shifted. The boardroom on the 23rd floor had been prepared before anyone arrived. The table was set with clean lines folders placed at each seat, water glasses aligned. A digital screen, dark but ready. No announcement had been made to the broader staff. Only those required were present. Harold Bennett arrived 10 minutes early. He rarely did that. His steps were measured as he walked through the corridor, nodding to a few colleagues who greeted him out of habit. Nothing in their expressions suggested they knew anything had changed. That unsettled him more than if they had. Diane arrived shortly after, her posture composed but tighter than usual. She adjusted her sleeve once, then again, a small repetition that had nothing to do with appearance. "Did you speak to Xavier?" she asked quietly. Harold shook his head. "No." Diane exhaled. "He said he would handle it." Harold looked at her then. "That doesn't mean he can." The words were not harsh, just accurate. They took their seats without further discussion. Others filtered in. Department heads, legal representatives, a few senior managers who had been called in without full explanation. Victor Hale entered last among them, carrying a thin folder that looked less significant than it was. He greeted no one directly, just a brief nod as he took his place near the head of the table. The room settled. Conversation lowered, and then stopped, because the final person had arrived. Julia Bennett entered without announcement. She did not rush. She did not pause. Her pace was steady, her posture upright, despite the lingering strain in her body. She wore a simple, structured outfit in neutral tones. No visible display of status, no attempt to draw attention. She didn't need to. Every eye in the room followed her. Not because they understood why, but because something in the air had already shifted in anticipation of her presence. Harold's expression changed first. Not dramatically, just enough. Recognition without understanding. Diane's reaction followed. A flicker of confusion, then something sharper. Julia reached the head of the table and stopped. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Margaret Collins stepped forward from the side of the room. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," she said. Her voice carried easily, controlled, professional. "This meeting has been convened to address a structural update regarding ownership and governance." A pause. She looked around the room, making brief eye contact with each person. Effective as of last week, the controlling interest of Hale Infrastructure Group has been formally transferred. The words were clear, precise. They did not raise their volume. They did not need to. A quiet ripple moved through the room, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to be felt. Margaret continued. "All documentation has been reviewed, verified, and filed in accordance with corporate and legal standards." She stepped slightly to the side. Please direct your attention to the primary beneficiary and current controlling owner. There was no dramatic gesture, no pause for effect, only a simple shift in position, revealing Julia fully at the head of the table. Silence followed. Not confusion, not disbelief. Something deeper, a recalibration. Harold leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table as if grounding himself. Diane's lips parted, but no words came. Across the room, a manager shifted in his seat, glancing quickly between Julia and Victor. Xavier arrived then. Late. The door opened just enough to draw attention, and he stepped inside with the confidence of someone who still believed he understood the structure of the room. "I'm here," he said, closing the door behind him. No one responded. His gaze moved across the table, then stopped. On Julia, standing at the head, not seated, not waiting, standing. Something in his expression stalled, just for a second. Then he recovered. "What is this?" he asked, looking toward Harold, then Diane. "What's going on?" Margaret answered. "This is a scheduled board session," she said. "You were notified." Xavier frowned. "I wasn't told she'd be here." The statement carried an assumption that her presence required explanation. Julia did not respond. Margaret did. "She doesn't require an invitation," she said evenly. The room held still. Xavier looked back at Julia, now more carefully, as if trying to place something that had been in front of him all along, but never fully seen. "What is this?" he repeated. Julia met his gaze. Not with challenge, not with anger, just clarity. "Take a seat," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not leave space for refusal. Xavier hesitated, then pulled out a chair and sat. Not because he agreed, but because the room had already aligned in a direction he did not control. Margaret resumed. "As of this morning, all voting rights associated with the controlling interest have been executed under Julia Bennett's authority." She placed a document on the table. Victor followed, distributing copies. Harold picked one up. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. At the name, Julia Bennett, repeated, consistently, across every relevant section. Diane leaned closer, reading over his shoulder. Her breath caught. "Is this?" she began, then stopped, because the answer was already in front of her. Across the table, Xavier did not reach for the document immediately. He was still looking at Julia, as if the paper could wait, as if understanding her would somehow change what it said. "This doesn't make sense," he said. Julia did not move. "It does," she replied. He shook his head slightly. No, this is some kind of mistake. There's no way," Margaret interrupted. "There is no mistake," she said. "The transfer has been finalized, verified by independent audit and legal review." Xavier's attention snapped toward her. "You're telling me she owns this company?" Margaret held his gaze. "I'm telling you, she controls it." The distinction landed. Harder than the statement itself. Xavier leaned back in his chair. A short, disbelieving laugh escaped him. "That's not possible," he said. He stopped, because every version of that sentence required an assumption he could no longer prove. Julia had not claimed anything, had not argued, had not defended herself. And now, she did not need to. Victor spoke for the first time. "Effective. Immediately, all strategic decisions will be reviewed under updated governance," he said. "Any existing financial irregularities will be subject to internal audit." The words were calm, but targeted. Xavier's gaze shifted toward him. "What irregularities?" he asked. Victor opened his folder. "There are several transactions we'll need to discuss," he said. Harold looked up from the document. Slowly, his expression had changed. Not into anger, into realization. He turned his head toward Julia, and for the first time, he saw her without the assumptions he had carried for years. Diane followed. Her earlier certainty had dissolved into something quieter, more uncertain, more aware. Julia remained where she was. Her hands rested lightly against the edge of the table, her posture unchanged. She did not look at the documents again. She did not look around the room. She looked only at Xavier, because he was the last one still trying to understand a version of reality that no longer existed. "This isn't over," he said. The words came quickly, instinctively. Julia held his gaze. "No," she said. And for the first time, there was something different in her voice. Not louder, not sharper, just final. "It isn't." The room did not move. No one spoke, because everyone understood in that moment that what had just been revealed was not the conclusion. It was the beginning of something that would follow a process none of them could interrupt, not with denial, not with familiarity, not with the version of her they had believed in, because that version had never been complete. And now, neither was the story. No one reached for their water. No one checked their phone. The room held its breath in a way that made small movements feel louder than they were. Paper shifted as Harold turned another page. The faint rasp of it sounded deliberate, as if reading itself had become an act that required permission. Diane's hand hovered near the document but did not touch it. Across the table, two department heads exchanged a brief glance and then looked down again, choosing neutrality over curiosity. Victor Hale remained composed, his folder open, his posture steady. Margaret Collins stood to one side, not seated, not occupying space unnecessarily, but present in a way that made the structure of the room feel defined. At the head of the table, Julia did not move. She let the documents do what they were designed to do. Sequence, confirmation, authority. Xavier picked up his copy at last. He didn't read it from the beginning. He went straight to the signature page. His eyes scanned the lines quickly, then slowed. He read the names, the dates, the verification marks. He turned the page, then another, looking for something that would contradict the first. There was nothing. "This doesn't mean anything," he said, though his voice had already lost its earlier certainty. "Paper can say anything." Margaret answered without stepping forward. "Paper can say many things," she said. "These documents say one thing consistently across independent review. That consistency is what gives them weight." Xavier looked up at her. "And you expect everyone here to just accept that?" he asked. Margaret's gaze didn't shift. "I expect everyone here to follow the law and the structure of the company they work for." The distinction landed quietly. This was not a matter of belief. It was a matter of obligation. Xavier turned toward his parents. "You knew about this?" he asked. Harold's hands remained on the table. "No," he said. Diane shook her head slowly. "No." The word carried more than denial. It carried the beginning of something else. Recognition. Not of the situation, but of their position within it. Xavier let out a short breath, somewhere between a laugh and something tighter. "So what? What kept this from everyone," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Julia. "From me," Julia answered him directly. "Yes." No elaboration, no defense. The room shifted again, because the admission did not weaken her position. It clarified it. Xavier stared at her. "For how long?" he asked. Julia held his gaze. "Long enough?" The answer did not satisfy him. It was not meant to. He leaned forward, his hands flattening against the table. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said. "You sit there quiet, acting like you're not part of anything. And then suddenly you expect that to just make sense." Julia did not raise her voice. "I didn't ask you to understand it," she said. "I asked you to take a seat. A few people at the table shifted almost imperceptibly, not in reaction to the words themselves, but to the control behind them. Margaret stepped in before the moment escalated. "Let's proceed," she said. "There are additional matters to review." Victor nodded once and turned a page in his folder. Over the past 60 days, he began there have been a series of financial movements that require clarification. He slid a document across the table. Not toward Julia, toward Xavier. Xavier looked down at it but did not pick it up. "What is that?" he asked. "Transaction logs," Victor replied. "Accounts associated with your name or accessed through your credentials." Xavier's jaw tightened. "I don't work here," he said. "No," Victor agreed. "But your access points intersect with individuals who do." The phrasing was precise, deliberate. Xavier reached for the paper at last. He scanned the first few lines, then stopped. "These aren't illegal," he said quickly. "They're just transfers." "Some of them are," Victor replied. "Others require explanation." Harold leaned closer, reading over Xavier's shoulder now. His expression shifted again, from confusion to concern. "Xavier," he said quietly, "what is this?" Xavier didn't answer him. He was still reading, still trying to understand how much of this had been seen, how much had been recorded. Margaret spoke again. "These records will be reviewed internally," she said. "If necessary, they will be referred for external evaluation." Xavier looked up sharply. "You're not sending anything anywhere," he said. Margaret's expression did not change. "That decision is not yours to make." The words landed cleanly. Xavier pushed his chair back slightly. "This is ridiculous," he said. "All of this meeting, these documents, this is just an overreaction to a situation that got out of hand." The room held still, because that was the first time the incident had been referenced directly. Margaret did not respond immediately. She allowed the statement to exist. Then she said, "We will address that as well." She looked toward Julia briefly, not for permission, for sequence. Julia gave a small nod. Margaret reached into her folder and removed a separate document. "An incident occurred on Saturday evening," she said. In the presence of multiple witnesses, Xavier's expression hardened. "It was an accident," he said. Margaret placed the document on the table. "A recording exists," she said. Silence, not the same silence as before. This one carried direction. Xavier's eyes flickered, just once. But it was enough. "That doesn't prove anything," he said. "It provides context," Margaret replied, "along with witness statements and medical documentation." Diane's hand moved to her mouth, not in shock, in realization. Harold closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Slowly. "What kind of documentation?" he asked. Margaret answered. "Hospital intake, physician observation, timeline verification." Each word added weight. Not emotionally, structurally. Xavier looked at Julia, not with anger now, with something closer to calculation. "You're really doing this?" he asked. Julia met his gaze. "I'm following the process," she said. He shook his head. "This is still between us," he insisted. "It doesn't belong here." Julia's voice did not change. It stopped being between us when it happened in front of everyone else. No one interrupted, because no one could. Xavier looked around the room, at the faces that had been present that night, at the people who had said nothing, at the same people now saying even less. The difference was not in volume, it was in direction. Before their silence had protected him, now it did not. He leaned back slowly, the fight in his posture shifting into something less certain. "This is going too far," he said. Margaret closed her folder. "No," she replied. "This is exactly as far as it needs to go." Victor adjusted the papers in front of him. "The audit will proceed," he said, "as will the internal review." Harold looked down at his hands, then back at Julia. His voice when he spoke was quieter than it had been in years. "What happens now?" he asked. Julia answered him. "Now," she said, "everything is documented." A pause. Then calmly, and everything moves forward. The room remained still. Because forward in this context did not mean resolution, it meant process, sequence, consequence. And none of it would depend on how anyone felt about it. Only on what had already been set in motion. No one spoke for several seconds after Julia's last sentence. The stillness was not confusion anymore. It was alignment. The room had adjusted to a new center, and that center was no longer uncertain. Victor closed one folder and opened another. "Let's proceed with the evidentiary sequence," he said. The phrasing was deliberate, not emotional, not accusatory. It placed what came next into a structure that could not be dismissed as reaction. Margaret stepped forward again, a small device in her hand, not dramatic, not displayed, just present. "The recording referenced earlier has been secured in its original format," she said. "It has not been altered." Xavier's shoulders tightened. "You're not playing that here," he said. Margaret didn't look at him. She looked at the room. "This is a closed session," she said. "All participants are bound by confidentiality." A quiet acknowledgement moved through the table. Not spoken, but understood. Xavier leaned forward. "This has nothing to do with the company," he insisted. "You can't just—" Julia spoke. "It has everything to do with it." Her tone did not rise, but it interrupted him completely. He turned to her. How he demanded. Julia held his gaze. "Because conduct matters," she said, "especially when it intersects with access, influence, and decision-making." The words were not abstract. They were precise. Victor nodded once as if confirming the framework. Margaret continued. "We will not play the full recording," she said, "only the relevant segment." Xavier exhaled sharply, but he did not speak again. Because something in the room had shifted beyond argument. Margaret set the device on the table and pressed play. The audio was clear, not perfect, but clear enough. Voices carried, chairs moving, the tone of the room before the moment. Then Xavier's voice, measured at first, then sharper, then unmistakable. No one needed to interpret it. The words were exactly as they had been spoken. Julia remained still, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, her face unchanged. She did not look around to see reactions. She did not need to. The audio continued. The shift, the movement, the sound of the chair, the impact, a breath leaving the body, a voice Julia's quiet controlled saying 3 words. "Don't touch me." Margaret stopped the recording. Silence followed. Not the kind that waits for someone to speak, the kind that recognizes something has already been said in full. Diane's eyes were fixed on the table. Her hand trembled slightly, then stilled. Harold sat back slowly, his posture no longer rigid, but weighted. Across the room, one of the managers adjusted his glasses, not because they had moved, but because he needed something to do with his hands. Victor closed the folder in front of him. "The recording aligns with the written statements," he said, "and with the medical timeline." Xavier's voice, when it came, was lower. "That doesn't prove intent," Margaret responded. "It establishes conduct." He shook his head. "It was one moment," he said. "You're building an entire case out of one moment." Julia looked at him. "It wasn't one moment," she said. He held her gaze. "What are you talking about?" Julia did not look away. "It was a pattern," she replied. A pause. Then calmly, "This was just the first time it happened in front of witnesses." The words settled into the room with a different kind of weight. Not louder, but deeper. Because they extended the frame. Margaret reached into her folder again. In addition to the recording, she said we have documentation of prior communications. She placed a printed page on the table. Not toward Xavier, toward the center. Messages, she continued. Statements, behavioral indicators. Xavier looked at the page, but did not reach for it. This is private, he said. You can't just bring that in here. Margaret's expression remained neutral. It becomes relevant when it intersects with documented conduct, she said. Victor added, and when it raises questions about judgment. The structure was clear now. Not emotional, not reactive, layered. Xavier leaned back, his earlier resistance shifting into something less defined. You're trying to push me out, he said. No one answered immediately. Because the statement, while defensive, was not entirely disconnected from what was happening. Julia spoke. You placed yourself here, she said. He frowned. I'm not even part of this company. Julia's gaze did not move. You intended to be. The words were quiet, but they landed. Because they connected the financial records, the conversations, the assumptions, everything that had been building beneath the surface. Victor opened another document. The financial transfers we reviewed earlier, he said, suggest preparation. Xavier, Sawyer looked at him. For what, Victor did not hesitate. Access. The word was simple, but it reframed everything. Harold closed his eyes again briefly, then opened them. This is serious, he said, not to anyone in particular, just into the room. Diane nodded slightly, her expression distant now, as if she were seeing something she had chosen not to see before. Margaret closed her folder. The next steps are procedural, she said. Internal review followed by formal recommendations. Xavier let out a slow breath. You're going to ruin everything over this, he said. Julia looked at him. No, she said. A pause. Then with the same calm, I'm going to clarify it. The distinction held, because ruin implied destruction. Clarification implied exposure. And exposure did not create what was seen. It revealed it. The room remained quiet, not uncertain, not divided, aligned, because every piece had now been placed in sequence. The recording, the records, the statements, the timing. Nothing had been exaggerated. Nothing had been rushed. Everything had been allowed to settle into its proper position, as Victor gathered the documents in front of him. The audit will proceed immediately, he said. Effective today. Margaret added, legal filings will follow as appropriate. No one asked what that meant. They understood. Harold looked at Julia again, not with the same certainty he had carried before, but with something closer to recognition. You planned this, he said. Julia held his gaze. No, she replied. A pause. Then I prepared for it. The difference was subtle, but exact. And in that difference, everything that had happened found its place. Because preparation did not create the moment. It ensured that when the moment came, it would not be lost. Julia rested her hands lightly on the table, her posture unchanged, her voice steady. Is there anything else, she asked? No one answered. Because there wasn't. Not in this room, not in this moment. What remained would happen elsewhere, through channels that did not depend on opinion, only on record, only on sequence, only on what had already been made impossible to ignore. The meeting did not end with a declaration. There was no formal adjournment, no decisive statement that marked a clear boundary between what had been discussed and what would follow. Instead, the room shifted gradually, almost imperceptibly, as people began to gather their documents, close folders, and stand. Process had taken over, and once process begins, it does not require ceremony. Julia remained at the head of the table a moment longer than everyone else, not to assert position, but to allow the transition to complete, without interruption. Victor approached her first. "The audit team is already assembling," he said quietly. "We'll begin with the accounts flagged in the report." Julia nodded. "Keep the scope narrow at first," she said, "then expand only where the data requires it." Victor understood. Not aggressive, not reactive, precise. "It will be done," he said. Margaret joined them, her folder now closed. "I'll initiate the filings this afternoon," she said. "Protective measures first, then formal action." Julia turned slightly toward her. "Timeline initial submission." "Within hours," Margaret replied. "Court acknowledgement within 24." Julia accepted that without comment, because timing, like everything else, had already been considered. Across the room, Xavier stood alone. Not physically isolated, but functionally separate from the structure that had just formed around him. People moved past him without acknowledgement, not out of hostility, out of recognition. He no longer occupied the same position he had when he entered the room. Harold approached slowly, not with authority, with caution. "Xavier," he said. Xavier didn't look at him immediately. When he did, his expression had shifted again. Not defensive, not fully resigned, something unsettled. "You heard all of it," Harold continued. "I heard what they wanted to show," Xavier replied. Harold's jaw tightened slightly. "That's not how this works," he said. Xavier let out a short breath. "No," he said. "It's exactly how it works." Diane stood a few steps behind Harold, her arms folded loosely as if unsure where to place them. "Xavier," she said softly, "this isn't something you can push past." He looked at her. "And what do you want me to do?" he asked. There was no answer, not a simple one, not one that would return anything to what it had been. By early afternoon, the filings had begun. Margaret worked from her office, each document prepared with the same structure the meeting had followed. Clear, sequential, supported. The request for a protective order was submitted first, not as an accusation, as a precaution. It included the medical report from Dr. Emily Carter, the verified timeline from the hospital intake, the recorded audio segment, a summary of witness presence. No exaggeration, no interpretation, only alignment. Within the same submission, a separate motion was filed to formally restrict direct contact pending review. Not permanent, not final, but immediate. Julia returned home that evening, not because the house had changed, but because she had. The front door opened with the same quiet sound it always had. The interior looked exactly as she had left it. Clean, ordered, undisturbed. But something in the space felt different, not heavier, more defined. She moved through the living room, slowly taking in the details, without pausing on any of them. Her phone vibrated once in her hand. "Margaret, filed," she said. Julia nodded, though Margaret couldn't see it. "Understood. There will be a response," Margaret added. "There always is." Julia stepped into the kitchen. "I'm aware." A brief pause. "Do you want to stay somewhere else tonight?" Margaret asked. Julia considered the question, then no. Not out of attachment, not out of clarity. "I'll check in again later," Margaret said. The call ended. Julia placed her phone on the counter. For a moment, she stood still. Then she reached for a glass, filled it with water, and took a slow sip. The same action, the same motion, but not the same context. Across town, Xavier sat in a smaller room. Not an office, not yet a formal legal space, but close. A consultation room in a firm that had agreed to meet on short notice. Across from him, a lawyer reviewed the documents Margaret had filed. The man did not rush. He did not react. He read, then set the papers down. "This is structured," he said. Xavier leaned forward. "It's exaggerated," he replied. "It's being taken out of context." The lawyer did not disagree. He did not agree. What matters, he said, is not how you describe it. It's how it's documented. Xavier's jaw tightened. It was one moment. The lawyer nodded slightly. That may be your position, he said. But there is a recording. There are witnesses. There is a medical record. Each piece repeated. Not louder, but clearer. Xavier leaned back. So, what are my options? The lawyer folded his hands. You respond, he said. Carefully. You do not contradict what can be verified. Xavier exhaled. And the company. The lawyer glanced at the documents again. That's separate, he said, but connected. Xavier frowned. How? The lawyer met his gaze. Because your conduct affects how your actions are interpreted elsewhere, he said. Especially where access and intent intersect. The same structure, different room, same conclusion. Xavier looked away. For the first time, there was no immediate argument. Only the recognition that the path forward would not be shaped by what he wanted to say, but by what had already been set in motion. That night, Julia sat near the window. The street outside remained quiet, unchanged. Her hand rested lightly over her stomach. The movement there was steady now, consistent. She noted it, as she noted everything. On the table beside her, the documents from earlier lay untouched. They did not need to be reviewed again. They had already done their work. What remained would not depend on repetition. Only continuation. Julia leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, but not unguarded. The house was silent, not empty, just clear, because what had once been uncertain had now been defined. Not through confrontation, not through emotion, but through sequence, through record, through the quiet refusal to let a moment be reduced to something smaller than it was. Julia closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. Nothing about what came next required urgency, only consistency. And consistency, once established, does not break easily. It holds. It moves forward, exactly as it was designed to. By Wednesday, the responses had begun to arrive. Not loudly, not in ways that drew attention beyond the necessary channels, but each document, each notice, each acknowledgement carried the same underlying shift that had started in the boardroom. Everything was now moving within structure. Julia reviewed the first response at her dining table early that morning. The envelope had been delivered by hand, the timing precise, the method intentional. Inside, the language was careful. No admission, no escalation, only a formal reply that acknowledged receipt of the filings and requested additional time for review. Julia read it once, then set it aside, because it did not change the direction of anything. Across from her, her phone lit up briefly. Victor. She answered. The audit has expanded, he said. There are more connections than we initially identified. Julia leaned back slightly in her chair. Scope, she asked. Indirect accounts, Victor replied. Patterns that suggest coordination rather than isolated decisions. Julia absorbed that. Document everything she said. No assumptions, of course. A pause. Harold has been cooperating, Victor added. Julia did not react outwardly. In what way he's provided internal context, Victor said. Process access points, nothing defensive. Julia nodded once. Understood. The call ended. She remained seated for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly against the table. Not surprised, just noting. At the Bennett house, the atmosphere had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Diane moved through the kitchen, slowly, her usual routines interrupted by pauses she did not acknowledge. The familiarity of the space no longer provided the same sense of control. Harold sat in the living room, a folder open in front of him. He had not gone to work that morning, not because he had been told not to, but because the structure of his role no longer felt as stable as it had days before. Diane stopped in the doorway. "They contacted you again?" she asked. Harold didn't look up immediately. "Yes. And they asked for clarification on several procedures," he said. "Nothing outside of what I already know." Diane stepped further into the room. "You gave it to them. It was not a question." Harold looked at her then. "I gave them what was accurate." Diane's expression tightened. "That's not the same as protecting your son." Harold held her gaze. "No," he said, "it isn't." The words settled between them. Not as conflict, as definition. Diane turned away first, because she understood even if she did not agree. Xavier received the second notice just after noon. He was sitting in the same consultation room as before, though the chair felt different now, less stable, less anchored. His lawyer placed the document in front of him. "They're moving forward," he said. Xavier didn't reach for it immediately, with what he asked. "Formal review," the lawyer replied, "and continuation of the protective order." Xavier leaned forward slowly, taking the paper at last. "They don't have enough for that," he said. The lawyer did not respond right away. Instead, he waited until Xavier finished reading. "They have enough to proceed," he said. "Whether it holds long-term is a separate question." Xavier exhaled, setting the document down. "This is being pushed too far," he said. The lawyer folded his hands. "It's being followed through," he corrected. A subtle distinction, but one that mattered. Xavier looked at him. "So what do I do?" The lawyer's answer was immediate. "You stop trying to control the narrative," he said, "and you focus on what can actually be addressed." Xavier's jaw tightened. "And that is the facts," the lawyer replied. "Not your interpretation of them." The room fell quiet, not empty, just clear, because there was no version of events left that could be reshaped through repetition, only what had already been recorded. That evening, Julia received a message she had anticipated. Diane. The name appeared on her phone without urgency. Julia looked at it for a moment, then answered. "Julia," Diane said. Her voice carried a different tone now, less certain, less structured. "We need to talk." Julia stood near the window, her posture relaxed. "We already have," she said. "This is different," Diane replied. "This is personal." Julia did not respond immediately. Diane continued. "I didn't understand," she said. "What was happening? What you were dealing with?" Julia listened, without interruption. "I should have said something," Diane added. "That night." A pause. "I didn't." The admission remained in the space between them. Not heavy, just present. Julia's voice, when it came, was unchanged. "You're right," she said. Diane's breath caught slightly. "I'm trying to fix this," she said. Julia looked out the window. The street remained quiet, unchanged. "This isn't something you fix," she said. Diane fell silent, because she understood. Not completely, but enough. "What happens now?" she asked. Julia's answer was simple. "It continues. No elaboration, no reassurance. Just the truth of the process already in motion." The call ended shortly after, not abruptly, just without anything left to add. Later that night, Julia sat in the same chair she had used days before. Her hand rested lightly over her stomach. The movement there was steady, consistent. She noted that, as she noted everything. On the table beside her, the documents remained in place, untouched. They no longer required review. They had already entered the system. The part that followed would not depend on her presence in a room, only on the structure she had already set. Julia leaned back slightly, her breathing even. There was no sense of victory, no release, because nothing about this had been constructed for that purpose. It had been constructed for clarity, and clarity, once established, does not produce satisfaction. It produces direction. Across the city, the same direction was being followed in different rooms, by different people, each step aligned with the last, each action supported by record, each response contained within the structure that had been built long before the moment that exposed it. Julia closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. Everything that needed to be seen had been seen. Everything that needed to be recorded had been recorded. What remained would not change that. It would only confirm it, and confirmation, once it begins, does not require force. Only time. The final hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. No media, no spectators beyond those required. The courtroom held the same restrained order as every other room that had carried this process forward, structured, quiet, and resistant to anything that did not belong to the record. Julia arrived early, not to prepare, but to remain consistent with everything that had come before. Margaret Collins sat beside her, reviewing the last set of documents. The file was complete, not expanded, not embellished. Every page served a purpose. Across the aisle, Xavier entered with his attorney. He did not look at Julia immediately. He took his seat, adjusted his posture, and focused on the table in front of him. The movement was deliberate, controlled in an attempt to restore a sense of balance that had been steadily removed over the past days. When he finally looked up, Julia met his gaze. Not with hostility, not with relief, only recognition. The judge entered shortly after. The proceedings began without delay. Margaret spoke first. Her voice remained measured, her language precise. She did not raise the tone. She did not introduce anything new. She did not need to. She outlined the sequence. The incident. The recorded evidence. The medical documentation. The internal findings from the company review. The financial records tied to Xavier's actions, each point aligned with the last. No deviation. No emphasis beyond clarity. Xavier's attorney followed. His approach was equally structured. He did not deny the existence of the recording. He did not dispute the medical report. Instead, he framed the incident as isolated. A moment. An error. He emphasized lack of intent. He questioned escalation. He suggested that what had been presented was disproportionate to what had occurred. The argument was not without structure, but it lacked something the other side had: continuity. When it ended, the room returned to stillness. The judge reviewed the documents in front of him, turning pages slowly, not for effect, but for confirmation. Then he looked up. The court does not evaluate isolated statements, he said. It evaluates sequence. The word held. Sequence. It had been present from the beginning, not spoken in this room, but built into everything that had led here. The incident itself is not being considered in isolation, the judge continued. It is supported by recorded evidence, corroborated by witness presence, and aligned with medical documentation. A pause. He turned a page. In addition, he said there are financial and behavioral elements that intersect with questions of judgment and access. The structure expanded. Not dramatically, just enough. The judge placed the file down. The request for continued protective measures is granted, he said. No reaction followed immediately. Not relief, not resistance. Just acknowledgement. The words had already been expected. The court will also allow the internal review findings to proceed within their respective channels, he added. A formal recognition of everything that had been built outside the courtroom. Xavier did not speak. He remained still, his hands resting on the table, because there was nothing left to interrupt, nothing left to reframe. The process had reached its conclusion not through a single statement, but through accumulation. Margaret inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor." The hearing ended without further discussion. No closing remarks, no final exchanges. Only the quiet movement of people standing, gathering documents, exiting in the same measured order they had entered. Outside the courthouse, the day continued as it always did. Traffic moved, voices carried. Nothing in the air reflected what had just been decided inside. Julia stepped onto the pavement slowly. Margaret walked beside her. "It's complete," Margaret said. Julia nodded. "Yes." They stood for a moment without speaking, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be added. Margaret looked at her. "You handled this exactly as it needed to be handled," she said. Julia did not respond immediately. "Then it was handled," she said. The distinction remained. Margaret understood it. "I'll finalize the remaining filings," she said. "After that, everything moves into maintenance." Julia inclined her head slightly. "Thank you." Margaret gave a small nod, then turned and walked toward her car. Xavier exited the building on the opposite side. He did not look toward Julia. He did not look toward anyone. He walked with the same controlled pace he had maintained throughout the hearing. But the control no longer carried direction, only habit. His attorney spoke briefly beside him, outlining next steps, possible responses, adjustments that could still be made within the remaining framework. Xavier listened, but not fully, because for the first time, the structure around him did not respond to his input. It continued without it. He reached his car and stopped. For a moment, he stood there. Then he got in and left. That afternoon, Julia returned to the office. Not for a meeting, not for a statement, just to complete what remained. Victor met her in the hallway. "The audit is closing its initial phase," he said. "Findings are consistent." Julia nodded. "Proceed to the next stage," she said. Victor inclined his head. "It's already in motion." They did not speak further. There was no need, because everything now followed the same pattern, clear, sequential, unaffected by anything that had already been resolved. In the evening, Julia returned home once more. The house remained unchanged, the same quiet, the same arrangement, but it no longer held uncertainty. She moved through it without pause, setting her bag down, placing her phone on the table. Her hand rested lightly over her stomach. The movement there remained steady, consistent. She noted that. Then she walked to the window and looked out. The street was the same, unaware, unchanged. But that had never been the point, because what had changed was not the world around her. It was the structure beneath it. And that structure would continue to hold, not because it had been forced, but because it had been built correctly. Julia stood there for a moment longer, then turned away. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to reveal, only what came next. And what came next did not require explanation, only continuation. The story does not end where the process concludes. It lingers in the space after. In the quiet moments where nothing dramatic happens, yet everything has already changed. Julia did not walk away with celebration. She did not look back for acknowledgement. What she carried forward was not victory, but clarity. And clarity, once earned, does not need to announce itself. There are moments in life when silence is mistaken for weakness, when restraint is seen as absence, when patience is interpreted as submission. But sometimes silence is simply timing. Sometimes restraint is structure. And sometimes patience is preparation. What unfolded here was not sudden. It was not impulsive. It was built piece by piece long before anyone else recognized it. And when the moment came, it did not explode. It aligned. If you've stayed with this story until the end, you've seen how truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly and stays. If you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, I'd be curious to know where and what time it is there for you. Stories like this move differently depending on where we are when we hear them. And if this kind of story where strength is quiet and justice is patient means something to you, you're welcome to stay for more.